Jamie Raskin just asked the question Republicans can't answer. When it comes to Jeffrey Epstein, who are they protecting?
Ranking members recognized for an opening statement.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to the distinguished gentleman for his statement. I'm pleased we're marking up the Bipartisan Trafficking Survivors Relief Act, a bill which is going to provide relief to victims and survivors of human trafficking who themselves have been unjustly targeted and criminalized as a result of their involvement in trafficking as victims. We've been pushing for nearly a decade to make this relief available at the federal level, and I'm delighted that we're able to work together on a bipartisan basis, and I look forward to its swift passage. But America, Mr. Chairman, is going to be wondering how we can pass a bill today called the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act when we turn a blind eye and a cold shoulder to the trafficking survivors who came to Washington, D.C. last week to demand the complete, comprehensive release of the Epstein files. It's not going to make any sense to America. In fact, it's going to look like we're trying to cover up for the cover-up that's taking place of the Epstein files. You know, the administration moved unilaterally to get Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein's co-conspirator, partner in sex crime, moved from her prison in Florida to a minimum security prison nicknamed Club Fed in Texas. This shocked the Epstein survivors who came to Washington last week and said this blatantly preferential treatment of Maxwell, which may border on witness tampering, was, quote, the justice system failing victims right before our eyes. But this isn't just about Jeffrey Epstein or Ghislaine Maxwell. I mean, who's being protected by the members of Congress who refuse to sign on to the discharge petition? By the way, we have a new member of Congress today from Virginia who has just come to join us. And he's adding his name to the discharge petition. That means any one of my colleagues on the Republican side can be the deciding signature on the discharge petition. You can take a stand and be a profile on courage, at least in standing up against Donald Trump. It's not really a profile on political courage because the vast majority of the American people want to see it. But I guess these days standing up against Donald Trump is what qualifies as political courage in Lincoln's party. But look who's being protected if you don't sign it. Well, all of those who abused children right alongside Jeffrey Epstein. All of his unnamed, unidentified co-conspirators who were protected by Alex Acosta's original corrupt bargain immunity agreement. All those people are being protected by your silence, your passivity. All of the banks, like Deutsche Bank, which allowed, facilitated, and failed to report the transactions that allowed this massive child trafficking ring to proceed. Millions and millions of dollars moving around the country to give to the girls, to cover it up, to pay people off. And then the modeling agencies that were used as a big cover story to traffic and abuse these children. That's who's being protected by your complicity with this new plot after Donald Trump performed a U-turn and decided, no, he didn't want the Epstein files out anymore. But that's not all, because this administration has been systematically dismantling 25 years worth of bipartisan progress made in combating trafficking and in protecting the victims and survivors, all while claiming they're making America safe again. But they're starving the offices and programs of funding and of staffing, and they've made it much harder to prosecute child traffickers and sex offenders. In February, the DOJ's Office on Violence Against Women removed all information on funding opportunities against human trafficking from the website. In April, the DOJ's Office of Justice Programs terminated hundreds of grants awarded to state and local law enforcement, defunding the police, and nonprofit groups that help survivors of sexual and domestic violence. Take the Hope and Healing Survivor Resource Center, based in the chairman's beautiful home state of Ohio. Hope and Healing provides emergency shelter, crisis services, and support to survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking, including women like Casey, a stay-at-home mom who found a loaded pistol and 2 shotguns hidden in her house just days after her husband sexually assaulted her. Hope and Healing was able to get Casey and her kids out of the house and helped her to land on her feet. Federal grants make up 75% of that group's budget. Losing that funding would force Hope and Healing to fire their staff, including court advocates who help survivors navigate the legal system. This is going on throughout the federal government. They are gutting the anti-human trafficking programs. So leaving aside all of the political finger pointing back and forth and who got there first to denounce child sex trafficking and so on, let's leave that to the side. Why don't we get together and say that we are going to work together to restore all of the funding and all the programs that have been gutted by the Trump administration so far. And we'll have more to say about exactly how that's happening. I'm glad to see Congress is going to act to support victims and survivors in this bill. I urge my colleagues to support it, but I would also encourage all of our colleagues across the aisle to join committee Democrats to ensure that the federal government is doing whatever it can to empower the survivors and the victims of sex trafficking. I yield back.
When Jamie Raskin speaks in this hearing, he isn't just arguing a point. He's exposing a contradiction that cuts to the heart of how power in Washington works. He asks a devastatingly simple question: who's being protected by refusing to release the Epstein files? And that question carries more weight than most people realize. Here's why it matters. The Epstein case was never just about one man. It was about the network around him, the bankers who moved his money, the institutions that looked the other way, the agencies that gave him cover, and the powerful figures who were protected by silence. Epstein operated in plain sight for decades, and he got away with it not because nobody knew, but because too many people in positions of authority chose not to act. So when survivors traveled to Washington last week, their demand wasn't complicated. They weren't asking for special treatment. They weren't asking for political favors. They were asking for transparency, for the complete release of files that could finally expose who else was involved and who enabled Epstein's crimes. Epstein operated in plain sight for decades, and he got away with it not because nobody knew, but because too many people in positions of authority chose not to act. So when survivors traveled to Washington last week, their demand wasn't complicated. They weren't asking for special treatment. They weren't asking for political favors. They were asking for transparency, for the complete release of files that could finally expose who else was involved and who enabled Epstein's crimes. Yet instead of swift action, what they saw was Congress hesitating, lawmakers finding excuses, and some outright refusing to move forward. Raskin's frustration is clear. How can you, on one hand, pass a bill called the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act, a bill meant to support victims, and then, in the same breath, deny survivors the very truth they've been pleading for? To a lot of Americans, it looks like lawmakers are trying to cover up the cover-up. And for the survivors who testified that Maxwell's lenient treatment felt like witness tampering, it's a slap in the face. Now, let's pull back even further. This debate isn't only about Epstein and Maxwell. It's about whether Congress is willing to confront the uncomfortable reality that systems designed to protect the vulnerable often bend to protect the powerful. Banks like Deutsche Bank facilitated Epstein's transactions. Modeling agencies provided him a cover. Political figures were granted immunity deals. If Congress refuses to release the files, they're not just protecting Epstein's legacy, they're protecting an entire infrastructure of exploitation. And here's the hypocrisy that Raskin calls out. Many of the same lawmakers resisting transparency were once vocal about wanting accountability. But once Donald Trump shifted his position, so did they. Transparency stopped being a principle and became a political bargaining chip. That's why Raskin says this is no longer about profiles and political courage. It's about whether you're willing to stand up to Trump even when the majority of Americans, across party lines, want these files released. But there's another layer here too. Over the past several years, federal programs that once supported trafficking victims have been gutted. Grants that funded shelters, legal advocates, and survivor services have been slashed. Organizations like Hope and Healing in Ohio, groups that provide shelter for women escaping abuse, are being forced to cut staff and close programs. Survivors are being abandoned at the very moment when transparency is needed most and when funding should be increased. The rug is being pulled out from under them. So when Jamie Raskin says who's being protected, he's not just pointing a finger at Republicans in that room. He's forcing us all to confront the uncomfortable truth. Protecting Epstein's enablers means betraying survivors. Protecting political power means betraying the public. And if Congress continues to hide behind excuses, the cost isn't just political, it's human. Survivors pay that price every day. That's the heart of this issue. Survivors of trafficking already had their voices stolen by abusers. Now they're watching politicians steal their chance at justice. That's why this hearing matters. That's why Raskin's question lingers. Because unless lawmakers act, unless they sign the discharge petition, the answer to who's being protected is clear, not the victims. And this is where you come in. If survivors can summon the courage to speak out after everything they've endured, then the least we can do is echo their voices. Don't let politicians bury this story. Don't let the files stay hidden. Keep asking the question Jamie Raskin asked on the record, who's being protected? And if the answer is anything other than the survivors, then it's time to hold those in power accountable.